So this session is being recorded. You'll be able to access it afterwards. Everyone who's registered will be sent a link to the recording, and it'll just live on our website as well. My name's Diani Feiga. I'm the Director of Preservation Services at the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, and I want to welcome you to our second online open forum in the Putting Best Practices into Practice webinar series. This series, presented by the Conservation Center for Art and Historic Artifacts, is funded generously through the National Endowment for the Humanities, so definitely want to give a thanks to NEH for helping us out and enabling us to produce this. So this is an open chat forum. Maggie Downing, our digital imaging coordinator, will be taking over the mic in just a moment. Just a few very quick notes of housekeeping. The way that this works is you all should be able to hear Maggie, but she and I will not be able to hear you. So if and when you have questions, please type them in the chat box that you should see toward the center of your screen. And she will respond verbally to that. That's the way it'll be recorded as well. Her email address is up there on the screen in the image towards the right. So I suspect strongly that if you have questions or need to follow up or anything after this presentation, she'd be more than happy to address your questions and thoughts via email. So like I said, we really with only an hour, I'm sure that hour will fly by, and you definitely may need to reach out to her following this program. Just another, I'm going to step off in just a moment, but just want to give a heads up. The next program in this series is going to be on May 30th. Our coworker Samantha Forsco is going to be speaking about preservation on a shoestring, creative solutions for storage challenges. So that is not, we're alternating free programs with paid lecture type webinars. That one is not going to be free, so please check out the education calendar on CCAHA's website for information on registering for that. That one will be followed with another open forum at a TBD date in June. So without further ado, I am going to step off. I'll be on the program the entire time to try and help out with logistical technical issues if there are any, but as far as talking, I'm going to pass things over to Maggie, who is happy to take your questions whenever you're ready to start typing. So thanks everyone and welcome.
Thank you, Diani. As she mentioned, my name is Maggie. I'm the Digital Imaging Coordinator here at the Conservation Center. I've been in this role for about 9 months, and my role is to meet with clients and discuss their imaging needs. This can range from a single high-resolution file of one artifact they've brought here for conservation to projects that have tens of thousands of pages that need imaging. I oversee all in-house imaging projects, including facsimile printing, and I've also been consulting institutions on large-scale digitization planning and digital preservation planning for digital assets. I'll be speaking mostly to special collections and flat art collections, since that's most of the type of material that we deal with here at the Conservation Center. So I look forward to addressing your questions. This is a rather open-ended forum, so there may be some questions that may require more research or time on my end. If that's the case, we can certainly follow up via email. Just to talk a little bit more about the services that we do here. We do high-resolution image capture of artwork, documents, photographs, and negatives. We have a skilled team of technicians that are trained to handle very fragile materials. We often work on projects that come in for treatment, but we also do standalone digitization projects. One large one that we are wrapping up soon is for the Moravian Archives in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And we recently finished digitizing about 13,000 pages of church ledgers for them that were in an archive in Antigua. And this was did not receive any conservation treatment and is funded through a clear digitization grant. I see a little bit of typing, so don't be shy. I can take any questions as they come up. Digitization in general can be a great tool to fulfill an institution's mission to make materials available to a wide audience. It can also be a part of your preservation planning to provide backups of information. It increases discoverability of material. It can reduce handling on fragile materials. It can print a facsimile to display light-sensitive material that might not be suitable for a long-term exhibition. But I imagine that most of you are here because you've already answered the question of why you want to digitize, so let's get into it. We have one question here. Have you worked with any digitization projects for the Internet Archive? If yes, how does the OCR work through that system? That's a great question. I haven't done any work through the Internet Archive personally, but we have worked with institutions that are interested in archiving their web presence through the Internet Archive. So unfortunately, I don't know off the top of my head how the OCR, which is optical character recognition, works with the Internet Archive, but we can follow up with that if you'd like over email. I can do a little more digging on that. I see a little bit more typing. Just to give you, oh, here we go. When digitizing records owned by a church, does the church need to be concerned about copyright? Should they put a watermark on the items or a tagline indicating that the church owns the records? Copyright is a very complicated issue. The materials that we were digitizing for the Moravian archives were all from the 19th century and in the public domain. So that wasn't an issue for this project. But there are many types of notices that you can adapt to your needs, and those should be embedded in the image metadata and also made clear to your users online. Watermarks are less advised. I advise people not to use watermarks so much because it kind of obscures the image. They can be removed and it reduces the usability of the image. But placing a copyright notice with the image online should go a long way with that. We have another question here. While not a flat media, do you have suggestions for digitizing video, specifically from VHS to DVD or digital file, equipment, programs, etc.? Unfortunately, I haven't had any direct experience with digitizing video, but we do work with a collection or a selection of AV preservation and digitization companies, and I would be happy to email you a link to that. Thanks, Katie. I got another question from Nora. Is it better to digitize at the highest resolution and then scale down as needed, or better to make multiple sizes as you go? Typically, you want to digitize only once. So the idea would be to digitize at the highest resolution that is appropriate to the material. So this could be a 400 ppi file for something that's like an 8x10 photograph or a document. For smaller media such as slides and negatives, you may want to go even higher in your ppi. And some slides and negatives you may want to digitize up to 2000 ppi. Then you want to, from that master file, you can create derivative files for web use and for sharing. We look to the federal agency's digital guidelines initiative here at CCAHA. That goes by the acronym FADGI, and they provide very detailed document on guidelines for file sizes and specifications for a variety of media, including bound volumes and special collections, manuscripts, newspapers, and photographic prints. So it can be kind of an overwhelming document, but it has a summary table for each type of material that can be really helpful in deciding on a master file size. Here's the next question. In an NDCC course, I was told we scan for access, not to replace the original. In 3 to 4 years, we're moving, and higher ups keep telling me we can scan everything over 600,000 still photos and get rid of the original film. I'm thinking scanning isn't even the issue, it's the lack of metadata, right? Regarding the first part of your question about scanning for access and not to replace the original, it depends on the role of the film in your collection. It's possible that the film was, if it was the film taken as a replacement for the collection, or is the film the part of the original collection? As I'm a little bit confused on that part. For if it's like scanning microfilm, which was already created as an access copy of another type of material, that might be the case that you could get rid of the original. So I'm not totally clear. If the original artifact is the film, then you definitely do still want to keep that. Scanning and lack of metadata. Metadata is a very important part of any scanning project, and should be done as you go through it. One way to work through this is to take the original artifact and assign it basic descriptive metadata, including the author, the title, the location, and as it's scanned, then assign even more metadata, including the copyright, the and administrative data and preservation data. So yeah, 600,000 still photos is a massive project, and shouldn't be undertaken without creating metadata alongside it. Could you provide recommendations for a handful of DAM, digital asset management programs, to implement for a small archive of photographs and digitized documents? In the Digitization Forum resources document I have attached, there is a link to a Google Sheet that somebody has put together that outlines a large amount of collection management and digital asset management systems, including locally sourced and open source and proprietary, locally hosted and web hosted. And it really outlines a lot of different programs. So I would recommend taking a look at that and kind of determining what your institution really needs out of a digital asset management program, and create a prioritization matrix based on the needs that you have for that. It is a century of still photos taken over. Oh, okay, taken over the history of the agency. So I would recommend still maintaining the original if that is the accessioned artifact. But the digitized, the scan can be the access copy, and the films could be placed in, deep storage. What do digitization guidelines suggest for archival scanning glass negatives? How do you overcome Newton's rings or Newtonian rings? It seems not very clear there in the guidelines. Should one guideline should one use guideline for transparent materials? So the FADGI recommendations for negatives also apply to glass plate negatives, and they have different recommendations for negatives below 4 by 5 inches and above 4 by 5 inches. One way to avoid Newtonian rings is to scan it with the emulsion side down, if that is a stable enough. If there's no emulsion flaking, that's one way to do it, and then flip it in Photoshop afterwards. If you're concerned about placing the emulsion directly onto the glass of the negative, you could also place a sheet of plexiglass in between the negative and the scanning sheet, the scanning glass. And while that does create a little bit less contrast, it is another way to avoid the Newtonian rings. Another way to overcome that is to not photograph negatives on a scanner at all, but rather to shoot them with a medium format camera over a light box. This is a great solution for anybody that has a large collection of negatives or transparent materials, is to invest in a high quality even light box, macro lens, and a medium format camera, and shoot everything on a copy stand. You can acquire a very high resolution with just almost a couple of seconds, rather than spending 30 minutes or more scanning at a high resolution on a flatbed scanner or film scanner. Diani says the American Association for State and Local History is currently in the process of developing a guide to digital asset management systems and content management systems. Definitely check out the Google Sheet that Maggie has linked in the handout. Thank you, Diani. But keep your eye out for the guide coming through AASLH as well. I know that's going to be a very popular guide. We do get a lot of questions about how do you even begin to select a DAM or a content management system. Thank you. I see a little bit more typing.
Yeah, I realized in the beginning that I neglected to mention there is a Digitization Forum resources document. You should see it under Files on the top left of your screen. You can just click on that and download the files, and that is a list of resources that Maggie has put together with links and citation information, so that should be pretty valuable as well.
So in regards to the equipment that we use here at CCAHA, we use it for most materials. We use a phase 100 megapixel digital camera on a copy stand and photograph books on a book cradle. This gives us a lot of versatility in the type of materials that we image here, and it's the main tool that we use, except for the few transparent materials that we get coming through the center. Here's where does one go to get training on how to enter metadata and what to enter? Is there an online course or YouTube videos to follow? The Sustainable Heritage Network has some very great basic tutorials on entering metadata and what to enter. Typically, I recommend starting with a Dublin core. That's a set of metadata that is descriptive. It includes fields. There's 15 fields in Dublin core that include title, author, location, rights, and that's just a great place to start for a lot of cultural heritage institutions in their art collections. But I would definitely check them out, and Lyrasis also has webinars on metadata, different types of metadata, and different ways of entering it. Um, Very basic way of entering metadata is to simply create an Excel spreadsheet in which you include your accession number or file number and just have different columns that have those different fields and fill those in as you prepare your artifacts for digitization. Um, for architectural drawings and blueprints, we have sets of previous revisions and also as-built drawings. We are getting these scanned at 600 DPI and PDFA format. Should we keep all of the paper copies as of previous revision steps or just the as-built? So I guess I have a follow-up question. Are you are are you imaging both? Are you imaging the revisions and the as-built? Um, I guess I'm not quite clear on that part. Um, we're getting all of the copies scanned. I think that just needs to come from your a records retention or collection management policy that you have in place at your institution of whether or not to dispose of originals. Um, a lot of institutional records are culled throughout the life of an institution as things are scanned, but in comparison to a fine art collection, this is not a very familiar practice. So I would just consult with your own policies in place for whether you can dispose. Um, if they're scanned, if all of the information is scanned, and the practice has been in the past to just dispose of records that are scanned, then I think that would be okay. Okay. Um, So if you're interested in setting up your own capture studio, there are certain things to keep in mind beyond just the digitization equipment. Um, you want to have a space where you can block out outside light. You want to have a level hard surface for your floor, and you want to have definitely have a staging area where staff can sit and prepare material that's on deck for digitization. Hi everyone, can you hear me now? I apologize. Sorry about that. Um, so I'll go back. Did any? Sure, yes. So thanks again to Lonnie for chiming in on Kate Wilson's question. I'll go ahead with continuing to describe our capture studio. The important is we have two capture studios. The major workhorse studio is about 10 feet by 5 feet. It's a small and efficient studio, but the appeal of having a small space is that the light is controlled, the environment is more controlled, and that can help you achieve greater accuracy and consistency in your capture. So it's a room where all of the light is blocked out except for the Profoto strobes that we use for the lighting. These are equipped with soft boxes, small soft boxes. Um, we use a Linhof book scanner. This is or book cradle, I apologize. This is a cradle in which a book can sit. Has two weighted panels so that they can move independently of each other, which helps reduce stress on binding. And there's a glass plate that comes over the top of the book to help with uh, creating an even plane for imaging. This is not the solution for all types of materials. We definitely get certain books that cannot be opened flat or near flat, and these will be photographed on a cradle or with other supports. Um, you want to have enough space for a staff member to sit comfortably and use the materials. You need to have some space that materials can be housed before digitizing, and an area where supplies can be um, centralized and the next material on deck to be digitized is there's space, like a table space for that. We typically photograph on black or white backgrounds depending on the type of material. White is ideal if you have a thinner paper in which you might have some bleed through. And that'll also help increase the contrast. Black also looks sharp on a lot of materials and looks good with books, but you want to make sure you use the same color for a full collection or project that you're working on. Again, we use a phase 1 digital medium format camera. And it's 100 megapixels, so we're able to capture in a single capture at 400 ppi. We can capture at 29 by 21 inches, and then at 300 we can go up to 38 by 29 inches. So that's a great first capture resolution. For larger materials, we can photograph in sections and then stitch them together in Photoshop. We have a quality control checklist as well as we go through. We are checking for file name and type. We're checking that the images are the correct size, resolution, color space, the color is correct. You want to avoid any heavy post-production of color correction, and that the crop and the skew is correct as well. You want to make sure we always have quality control is done by somebody independent of the operator. So it's somebody with a different eye to the material, specifically looking for these things as they are completed. So then that's an important part of any digitization project is to have that quality control checklist in place before you begin. So feel free to chime in with any other questions. Um, one of the other sample questions I had was, oh, oh, sorry about that. We have one here. I'd like to re-raise Erna Glick's question above about examples of using descriptive file systems. Um, is there something you'd like me to elaborate further on that, Erin? And here's another question. Do you recommend putting a black paper underneath a book page to scan or photograph so that there is no bleed through the reverse side of the paper? If you have a paper that has some translucency or transparency, I would recommend using a white paper so that the black isn't coming through as well. That'll help with your contrast. It's possible I may have been muted when I addressed the file naming system. So if that's the case, I'll just repeat my answer there. What are some examples of digitization projects where you had applied descriptive file name system rather than numeric? Thanks. Okay. Yes. So typically, we were working on an archival project in which the client wanted to be able to sort by date and author. So we have named the files by the date of the letter using a 4-year date, 2-year month, and 4-number year, 2-number month, and 2-number day, followed by the name of the author, and then followed by the page number. So this client did not have an accession number or anything for the letters themselves. So following the client's suggestion, this is how we've decided to name them. But if you do have accession numbers, I would definitely include those in your file naming. The idea is to make your file names understandable to people that come into your position or come into your institution years later and down the line, and they can figure out kind of what they're looking at. But in a lot of cases in archives or personal archives, not every item has its own number. So a short descriptive file name within an identified schema that you create for the project is important. So I have just some tips on getting started. If you have a large scale digitization project, this can be very overwhelming. It's important to break sizable collections into smaller pieces that can be addressed incrementally, and we recommend a phased approach to digitizing a full collection, which can make a project seem less daunting. When you are trying to prioritize different collections, you may want to create a matrix of different selection criteria. These can include criteria such as interest to researchers, to the institution, or to the community. It can include intellectual control, whether or not you have the material cataloged. It can include fundraising prospects, institutional importance, or how closely the material connects to the mission. You may consider the accessibility of the original. If it's difficult to access for researchers, this could be a big factor in pulling it for digitization. Uniqueness, whether or not the material exists elsewhere, if it is already scanned and accessible and discoverable through another institution, that may be a lower priority. Copyright status, aesthetics and visual appeal can be a priority in gaining buy-in and fundraising. Conservation status, if the material is rapidly deteriorating, this could push it up in your prioritization list. And ease of handling, this can definitely hold some weight and should be balanced against conservation status. When you're beginning a large digitization project, having an easy to handle, easy to image collection is a great place to start. It's a really satisfying moment to have digitized, say 500 photographs, even if they're all the same size and condition, to be able to get that through quickly can help build project momentum and staff morale and institutional buy-in that will eventually aid in future fundraising for the rest of your project. So that's a nice place to start. You want to have a thought to that as you begin. In preparing for the end product, would it be advisable to include a preferred citation? I'm not sure what you mean by that. Jacob, could you elaborate what you mean by the end product and preferred citation? Um, do you mean an end product as a final file or a website to share the collection? As in when the digitized item is placed in the public-facing display method, would it be a good idea to include a suggested citation that notes details about the item and the repository information? Yes, definitely. You can certainly include a suggested citation. Doesn't necessarily mean that people will use it, but it's a great thing to include to make sure that your material has all the information that users may need right at their fingertips. You also will want to include the right status and copyright status of the digitized item, even if you've decided that it can go on the public facing display method. It may still have some rights and limitations on reuse that you want to definitely make sure to make clear to your user. You're welcome. And I see some more typing. I'm hesitant to jump into another description of something, but I suppose I can continue to talk about prioritization and getting started on a big project. Um, as you are preparing for your first collection, if you've decided to do the digitization in-house, I cannot stress the importance of a pilot project. This is a small number of materials that you select to test your workflow, maybe 50 to 100 items, in which you test your camera setup, your lighting setup, your file naming, your workflow, and examine that and adjust as you go, rather than jumping right into it eagerly and realizing 10,000 captures later that your file naming was slightly off. It can be heartbreaking. I have a good collection of oversized objects, i.e. larger than 3 feet by 3 feet. There are maps, family history, charts, posters, and other such things. How do you go about digitizing such large pieces, and what do you do if the object doesn't lie completely flat? Great question. If the object has a good amount of contrast, in a lot of cases charts, posters, and maps do, these are excellent candidates for photographing in multiple sections and then stitching together in Photoshop. Photoshop does this automatically through an automated action, and it typically does a very excellent job at it. Another option is to seek out a large scale flatbed scanner, such as a cruise scanner. So we partner with another institution here in Philadelphia, and they can do a lot of our extremely oversized material, such as things that are 4 feet by 8 feet that we can take to them and do them in one scan. If an object doesn't lie completely flat, you can use some weights on the edges of it. If it's brittle and curling, I would recommend having it assessed by a conservator. That could be that some humidification can help unroll something and keep it more stable. If unrolling it may look like it will break it. Can you talk about your experience in digitizing and organizing large groups of photo prints, especially for photos that cover a long time period and also for multiple places, like a shoebox full of photos that was donated to the institution at someone's retirement? Um, yeah, so in the situation like this, where you have several collections of material, you're going to want to break it into sub collections like your shoebox full of photos and identify the needs for that material separately. You may also, depending on how large the collection is, you may also want to set up a prioritization matrix to determine what you're going to start with. You'll want to consider things such as the conservation status. If you are looking at material from a long time period, it may be that your 19th century negatives or carte de visites are at a greater risk of deterioration than your modern 4x6 prints, and you'll want to start with those. For photographic prints, you'll be able to use the same equipment for the full collection if they are all prints and there you don't have negatives. A flatbed scanner can go a long way on this project, or like I said, the medium format digital camera on a copy stand can speed this up greatly. Do you have any go-to resources for the physical preparation of archivally processed mixed media collections for digitization projects? Not at my fingertips. For it really kind of depends on the type of media that we're looking at, but if you want, we can certainly talk more about this over email. I'd be very interested in learning more about the collection that you have, and we can kind of discuss some preparation techniques for that. Thank you. As you're setting up a digitization project, you may be considering whether to do the scanning itself in-house or outsourcing it. There are definitely pros and cons to either one. If you set up in-house, you have greater control and flexibility over the workflow. The objects do not have to move off-site, which can be greatly appealing for very fragile and very rare materials. There are, however, large setup costs. A flatbed scanner will cost $1,000 or $2,000, but for a large-scale digitization project with a copy stand, lighting, and medium format camera, the setup costs can be very high, around $50,000 to $75,000. If you're scanning in-house, there's possibly limited expertise on the digitization team, and all of the quality control needs to be done in-house. For outsourcing projects, you are guaranteed a higher production level. You have on-site expertise at the digitizing institution. The vendor will absorb any costs of quality control and troubleshooting, but you do have less control over the workflow. You have to have very clear communication, and there is also the risk to artwork at any time it is in transit. One thing to keep in mind is that the scanning is only about a third of the cost and time of a digitization project. The metadata creation and indexing, along with project management, also needs to be accounted for when planning a project like this. If you're interested in kind of a cost outline for your digitization project, there is a link in the resources document that I provided that has, there's a digitizing cost calculator. And this allows you to enter information like your project staff, how many you have, what their salaries and benefits are, their different tasks such as metadata entry, percent of quality control, whether or not you need to remove fasteners, and for how many, what percentage of the collection that is. And it'll kind of give you a sense of how long it will take and how much it would cost based on that, doing it in-house. It's a nice way to give you a sense of what you're in for, but it is an online calculator, so definitely take it and as a grain of salt, as you will. But it's a nice tool just to get a sense of the scale and time commitment that you're looking at. Um, the when microfilming, when requested, does the Conservation Center store a copy of the finished film? So we don't do microfilming here at the Conservation Center, but we do store copies of files that we create for clients for up to 6 months. So when our final files are delivered to the client, we keep them here, and it potentially longer, but we are committed to keeping them here up to 6 months. So that's another backup for a client if anything happens to the hard drive or CD that we provided them the files on. Is metadata embedded to final files for clients? Typically, yes. So metadata that we record automatically is the technical metadata. This is the date that the image was captured, the type of device that was used to capture it, and the lens and the focal length and the aperture. All of this is recorded automatically. We do embed metadata into final files for the clients upon request, but what we don't typically do is create metadata for clients depending on the type of material. So if we are provided with a spreadsheet with the metadata, we can definitely embed that during the digitization project, but not being the subject matter experts, it's kind of outside of our wheelhouse to create the metadata. But it's an easy part of the digitization workflow to add that in. You're welcome. So just to talk a little bit about getting started on a project, just at the very beginning, you want to ask yourself questions about the scope of the project, what part of your collection you're digitizing and why. Perhaps you want to just digitize single miscellaneous items such as treasures, and you want to digitize a full existing collection. You want to clearly define your goals of the project, which will help with institutional buy-in and fundraising. And then once you have your big picture conversation that addresses what you want to digitize and why, and what funding opportunities there are, then you want to do kind of like a fact-finding and research phase, where you're selecting the standards to follow, what capture specs you're going to adhere to. It may be that you find that you can capture at a lower resolution than is recommended through FADGI or other minimum capture recommendations. If you're digitizing just to capture information, you may not need such a high resolution as if you were creating an artifactual surrogate for an item in which you need to capture the grain of the negative, for example. You want to assess your technical infrastructure, what equipment that you need, your funding and staffing needs, and address any copyright issues. Like I mentioned earlier in this, copyright is a complicated issue, and just because an institution owns the material does not necessarily mean that you own the rights to it or the rights to reproduce it. It's possible even the donor that gave the piece to the institution does not have the rights, even if they said they had the rights. And it's possible, even if the donor is the artist, they don't have the rights to it. Oh, and for example, if a photograph was taken for a news agency, even the photographer may not have the rights to it. So that's something to definitely assess. And Aaron, the acronym that I mentioned is FADGI. It's FADGI. That's the Federal Agency's Digitization Guidelines Initiative. Thanks, Diani. You're welcome. And I definitely recommend taking a look at that. It is also linked in the forum resources. As I mentioned, it's a very detailed document. It goes over a lot of material, and it can be kind of technically daunting. But the most helpful thing is at the beginning of each type of material that they outline, there's a table that gives you minimum capture specifications, file recommendations, and whether it can be color or black and white. So just to talk a little bit more about metadata, we talked about descriptive metadata such as Dublin Core, which includes keywords, author, dimensions, media. You also have administrative metadata that you want to consider, which includes rights management about regarding the copyright and intellectual property rights, and the preservation, which is information about archiving and managing the preservation activities on the digital file. There are tools for embedding metadata into image files in bulk. These include EXIF tool, And Photoshop and Adobe Bridge can also do this. Um, and as far as the metadata, you want to have a plan in place for these assets as you begin your digitization project. This should be something that you think about before you even begin. Thank you, Diani. Yes, it's almost 3 already. Um, yes, if anybody has any follow-up questions or any clarification questions, I'm happy to take them. I'm also available via email if you want to follow up. I know there were a couple people that I would like to have longer conversations with about their projects. You're welcome. Thank you all for coming and attending. Thanks, Nora. All right, guys. Looks like we're wrapping up. If there's any other last minute questions, just let me know. Oh, here we go. We know that it's ideal to have a file stored in 3 places. Can you recommend which types of storage are ideal? Yes, ideal cloud storage is acceptable and preferable. Server storage and cloud storage is acceptable. Um, it's important to keep in mind that the digitizing at very high resolution is going to yield very high file sizes. So cloud might be a great way to go for storing files. But you also want to have it maybe locally on a server or on a hard drive as another redundant backup for it. Hard drives, portable external hard drives are decreasing in price, and you can get 2 terabyte hard drives for around $70 or $80 now, and that can be a great way to back up your files as well. If you're only using hard drives and not using cloud storage, then you want to definitely ensure that there's a plan in place for checking them and migrating data as needed, and also that you have your copies in different geographical locations to maintain the safety of the material. And there are also different levels of cloud storage too that might affect the price depending on how accessible you need the files to be. You may be able to do like a deep cloud storage, or different types of cloud storage can affect the price.
All right. Thank you so much, Maggie. That was really informative, and thanks for being a sport as lots of different types of questions came at you over the past hour. Yet again, just want to reiterate, if anyone does have follow-up questions or things that might be easier to have more of a conversation about, please don't hesitate to reach out to Maggie. Want to thank again NEH for funding and supporting this program, and check out the rest of the offerings that we have coming up online on the CCAHA website education calendar. As I mentioned in the beginning, we have our next webinar towards the end of May, on May 30th, and we will have more to come every month after that. So thanks all for being a great audience and having some really great questions. And thanks again to Maggie, and we will hopefully see you in another session. Thanks, everyone.